All right, ladies and gentlemen, at 6 o'clock here on the 21st, my name is Steve Roach. I work with the Emory Alumni Association's regional engagement team. My work is focused on our mid-Atlantic region, stretching from Richmond to central New Jersey, and I work directly with our DC network, which is jointly hosting tonight's session. And I appreciate you all making some time tonight. Before we get started with our panel, just some general housekeeping items for these virtual programs from Emory. First and foremost, as we do have a full presentation, we want to make sure that you mute your microphone to decrease background noise or ambient noise during the presentation and discussion. So please keep yourself on mute, whether it's via phone or computer audio, using the phone icon in the bottom left-hand corner. At the same time, while we love matching faces with names, please make sure that your video is turned off for the time being. We will utilize video function later on, but please make sure that your video function is off, just so we can focus on the slide deck and presentation tonight. We have reserved a number of questions, but at some time at question and answer towards the end. So please utilize the chat function in the bottom menu bar to submit your questions for the discussion tonight. Both Alex, our moderator, and myself will be collating those to pose to Ken and Elliot during the course of the evening, but please submit your questions utilizing the chat function. But with that, I'm going to step aside and turn it over to Alex Heidemann with our DC network to introduce tonight's panel and our wonderful presenters who have opened up their evening to provide their expertise and background during a very critical time for our nation and democracy. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you for introductions and tonight's discussion.
Great. Thanks, Steve. All right, everyone. Welcome to Election 2020, the law of politics and the politics of the law. Thank you all for joining us here today. We're really excited for our two panelists, Ken Gross and Elliot Burke, to join us for a discussion on election law, campaign finance, voting, and other issues facing the country as we head into the 2020 election. We'll start with some brief introductions of our two panelists. Our first panelist, Ken Gross, is a 1975 graduate of the Emory Law School. Ken is a partner at Skadden and an authority on campaign law compliance, gift and gratuity rules, and lobby registration provisions. He frequently speaks on ethics in government and has been a featured guest on CNN, Fox News, and NPR Radio. Ken has also served on the faculty of George Washington University and NYU. Our second panelist is Elliot Burke. Elliot is a 1997 graduate of Emory Law School and is managing partner at Burke and Farah. He represents clients before congressional ethics and oversight committees, the FEC, the DOJ, inspectors general, and other federal and state departments and agencies. Elliot regularly conducts ethics trainings for members of Congress, and his commentary has appeared on Fox News, in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Once again, thank you, Ken and Elliot, for your time tonight. We're really excited to talk to you. So a little bit about today's structure. We're going to turn the mic over to Ken, who's got a short presentation for us on the Civil Rights Act and other surrounding issues. And then Elliot will follow with another short presentation. Then we'll open up the chat for more questions from the audience and call it a night. So starting with Ken.
Thank you, Alex and Steve. I'm going to give a brief history of voting and bring us right into COVID. And right up to this week, as SCOTUS has been active in adjudicating, as well as the lower courts, on the maze the thicket that we're working our way through to get through to November 3rd. Going way back before law school, probably to middle school, just talking about 14th and 15th Amendments after the Civil War, the so-called Reconstruction Amendment. Obviously, the 14th Amendment, maybe our most important amendment after this Bill of Rights, provided equal protection. And I'll go through these slides very quickly. If anybody wants a copy of them, I'm happy to provide them. The 15th Amendment provided the right to vote, regardless of race, creed, color, or prior condition of servitude. Despite these amendments, the Jim Crow era erupted, and very serious discrimination occurred regarding minority voters, Blacks and others, even though the Constitution said what it said. We don't have to go into all of that. And of course, women couldn't vote. Interestingly, when I was doing some research on this, before 1776, women actually were voting in the colonies. I guess they thought better of it when they came up with the Declaration of Independence. But almost exactly 100 years ago, August 26th of 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, giving women the right to vote. So everything was not going very well. There was a lot of discrimination, a lot of difficulty in voting, until the Supreme Court upheld probably one of the most important pieces of legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which at least pumped the brakes on discrimination. I would say did more than that. Made discriminatory practices illegal in Section 2, and then identified the states that were engaged in serious discrimination, most of them in the South, saying that they had to be clear, pre-clear, whatever practices they were engaged in that looked discriminatory with the Department of Justice, and if DOJ didn't like it, they would have to change it before the fact. And that was great until along came 2013 decision, Shelby, which is a Supreme Court, this written by Justice Roberts, the chief, in a 5-4 decision said, that pre-clearance thing, I don't like that too much. Our country has changed, even though there's some discrimination, it wasn't like it was. Therefore, we don't need to pre-clear, and declared sections 4 and 5, the pre-clearance provisions, unconstitutional, knocked them out. So section 2 stood. Justice Ginsburg and the minority, needless to say, was bouncing off the walls. Her famous quote about you don't throw away an umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And she also noted that the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, all of which we've mentioned so far, and the 24th and 26th Amendment talk about the right to vote, and it's Congress's right. So she's throwing it back to Congress, or did, and we might see some action depending on who controls Congress in the next couple of weeks here. Of course, not till next year. Even during the Trump years, the assessment, the Civil Rights Commission identified, problems, discriminatory actions in voter ID laws, closing of polling places in areas where minorities lived, early voting, making it difficult, purging of the voter rolls that had good people on them, over aggressive purging of the voter rolls. And now we're sort of living through it as we move into the COVID years. And you're reading and seeing about it every day on the news. Actually, the one thing that seems to be okay is we are getting poll workers because young people are stepping up. But the president has attacked mail-in voting and aggressively. And I think you've also heard that there really has been almost no problems with mail-in voting. Colorado, Oregon, Utah, Washington, these are states that have almost 100% engaged in mail-in voting. Republicans, Democrats all use it. And the instances of some kind of fraud involved in the process have been literally minuscule. And when there's been little cases here and there, they've been addressed. So, we've tried to do something to alleviate the voting problems because of the pandemic. People don't want to wait on lines. Drop boxes are a wonderful solution. I have a nice picture of one in Maryland where I vote. I used it. I literally kept the engine running on my car when I ran up to the drop box, threw my ballot in there and got back in and drove away. And now I see people in, Franklin County, Ohio, standing online, and people in Georgia, supposedly one person waited 11 hours. It just should not be difficult to vote. And the Electoral College is going to have to really resolve its disputes by December 8th. They meet on December 14th. We hope it will not be drawn out at the presidential level. The Supreme Court and the circuit courts have got into the act here. Most of these cases have upheld Republican legislative decisions that have frankly made it difficult to vote. In many cases, it has to do with signatures on mail-in ballots and other actions having to do with contracting periods in which you can request ballots. each decision on its own doesn't seem to be overly oppressive, but the collective effect has been one that it does create concern. And of course, this litigation is occurring in the swing states. Texas, you just couldn't request an absentee ballot without reason. You had to be over 65 years old. That got upheld. So most of those decisions were favoring the Republicans. There are a lot of state court decisions that the Democrats have prevailed in, but the ones where the higher ID requirements, where there was an effort to relax rules for in-person, for collecting signatures, all of that was not in favor of the Democratic position and was in favor of the Republicans challenging the laws. However, and I mentioned this at the outset, the Pennsylvania, which is sort of the end all to be all when it comes to the process of the ultimate swing state, I guess you might say. You probably heard earlier this week that the Supreme Court split in a 4-4 decision. Justice Roberts went with the 3 so-called liberal justices, creating this 4-4 split with an 8-person Supreme Court. What happened there is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that you should be able to count ballots within 3 days of Election Day, within 3 days of November 3rd, if it had a postmark on the ballot of November 3rd or earlier. And if there was no postmark, because some of these things don't get postmarked, even though they're supposed to be, if it was received within 3 days, within 72 hours of the election date, November 3rd, it would count. There was a lot of thought that that would be overturned because the Supreme Court was not ruling, and the Supreme Court sort of overturned the legislature in that case. The question is which prevails. You have a similar situation coming up in North Carolina, where you have a Republican legislature, arguably a state Supreme Court going the other way. I don't know if this Pennsylvania case is going to stand, but we're getting awfully close to Election Day. There's something called the Purcell rule, where the courts are not supposed to screw around too much, very close to the election date. So it may well be that this will stand and those votes will count. Hopefully people aren't cutting it that close, but that's going to happen. So it was a very significant decision, I think, where the Democrats prevailed. I don't know if there's going to be any more Supreme Court decisions coming down between now and November 3rd, but there could be. The North Carolina case is sort of ripening. The other interesting thing about Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the 3 states that, of course, Trump flipped in 2016 to win the electoral vote, is that those 3 states, of all the swing states, are the 3 that prohibit the beginning of the counting of ballots until Election Day. They can start it in the morning, like 7 or 8 o'clock. So they'll be counting feverishly mail-in ballots all day long. But when the polls close that evening, they will likely not be getting through them because there is an enormous amount. So if those 3 states are determinative, which they are likely to be, that's one reason we will not have a result on November 3rd. Unless there's a blowout, Biden, or less likely Trump, starts to win all these other states, Pennsylvania and Ohio and Arizona, and they become less important, I think we're going to have to be patient on the date of the election. But I think we're going to have unprecedented turnout, probably close to 70%, and much of it is going to be in the mail. So we're going to have to live through this. The fact that people are voting and waiting online untold hours is sort of good news and bad news. It's bad news that they have to wait, but it's a good news that they're exercising their right to vote. So with that, Elliot, you could talk about election assistance and we can answer any questions. And as I said, I'm happy to make my PowerPoints available, which have more detail on some of these cases that are working their way through the process.
Great. Well, thank you, Ken. Ken used the word thicket to describe sort of how we got here, and I think that's the perfect word to use. I'm just trying to share my slides now. I don't know if the, here we go. So what I'm going to talk about today is the federal government's role in election administration, money in politics, civil and criminal enforcement. This is the ultimate thicket that we're in. As Ken talked about, states actually set the standards for election, but there's obviously constitutional implications and a federal role to be played. So I'm going to touch on all of that today. If you look at this first slide, and this is not a political presentation, and so I don't want anybody to read it that way. This is strictly looking at where there can potentially be litigation and challenges. And so if you look at this map, President Trump's narrow victories in key states leaves him vulnerable to even a small swing in 2020. And those are the pink states that you see here. You can look and see what the margins are, and in some cases they're very, very small. And so when we look at it and what to watch on election night, and let's hope it's just an election night, but it likely will be at least a week, maybe longer. President Trump needs to win Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. He then needs to win one of the three swing states, Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. And he can lose all three of those if he wins Minnesota, although the numbers in Minnesota recently don't suggest that. But you can see here sort of what the breakdown is, what Hillary Clinton's votes were at the time compared to where Joe Biden is now. When we talk about the Electoral College, and Ken touched on this, the Electoral College timeline is governed by the US Code, the 12th and 20th Amendments, and state laws and political party rules. Again, the thicket of what we have to look at here. I'm not going to go through this entire calendar, but throughout 2020, you had candidates for electors nominated by state political parties and other organizations as is set by state law. You may have heard about questions about whether or not laws penalizing or replacing faithless electors are constitutional. This July, the Supreme Court actually ruled that they were valid. So hopefully we are not going to have electors that show up and decide to vote another way. Election day is also set by the US Code. And then between November 4th and December 14th, it's the counting of the popular vote and the filing of certificates of ascertainment following election day. The states then submit their totals. They need to be certified, and that's a whole process. With December 8th being the safe harbor deadline, that in a contested election in any state, if the state prior to election day has enacted procedures to settle controversies or contests over electors and electoral votes, if these procedures have been applied and results have been determined 6 days before the electors' meetings, these results are considered to be conclusive. This will be something that will come up again and again if we get to this date and things are still up in the air. On December 14th, the Electoral College meets, as Ken mentioned. December 23rd, the results are delivered to the designated officials, and the results must be delivered to those officials. January 6th, a joint session of Congress meets to count the votes, and then January 20th, the president and vice president are inaugurated. So when we look at history and sort of why we got here, this sort of goes over what happened with the 12th Amendment post 1796 and 1804, when we had a system that needed adjustment, and we did. We had two elections, 1824 and 1876, that resulted in challenges that required congressional action. In 1876, a federal commission was ultimately convened and voted along party lines, which gave the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes by a single electoral vote. And then we get to 2000, Bush v. Gore. I'm not going to go into the nuances of that decision, but ultimately the court held that the use of different standards of counting in different counties in Florida violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. That then led to another of reforms, including the passage of the Help America Vote Act in 2002. That created the Federal Election Assistance Commission. I currently serve on the Board of Advisors of that. I was appointed by Speaker Ryan and reappointed by House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy. It is a largely advisory body that works with the states, and it also receives funds from Congress, which it then decides based on the standards and via grants when states are eligible to receive those funds. They have, as an example, given out a lot of grants for security this cycle. It's an independent bipartisan commission. It doesn't have any real regulatory authority, but it is there to create federal standards and to advise the states on how, what are the best practices in election administration. Just a couple of words on the race for the Senate, and then we'll get back to the presidential. We talk a lot about what's going to happen with the presidential race. I can't speak to what's going to happen on election day, but chances are we're going to have at least one recount or a decision not being conclusive on election night with respect to the Senate seats. There are a number of open seats where the candidates are either polling better or worse than the president. You don't always see that, but this cycle, it's certainly happening. In 2016, every Senate seat in each state was won by the party that won the presidency. But Republicans are defending far more seats this cycle than Democrats, 23-12. Only 2 vulnerable Republican seats are in states won by Hillary Clinton. That's Susan Collins in Maine and Cory Gardner in Colorado. The remaining vulnerable seats are in states won by Trump, Jones, McSally, and Tillis. The second tier, Peters, Perdue, Loeffler, Cornyn, Ernst, Graham, and Daines are in states won by Trump. And in a Biden landslide, the Democrats could pick up as many as 7 seats. Again, looking at the map, this gives you a better sense of sort of what we're looking at. Now I want to jump to money and politics, because again, this is all related. We'll be hearing a lot about this. We've heard a lot about this. We don't hear as much about it now as Ken can attest, because there is not a quorum within the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission actually has nothing to do with the administration of election. It deals strictly with the enforcement of the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was passed in 1971, and then which was after Watergate and needed reforms there. It was amended in 74. It set limits on contributions by individuals, political parties, and PACs, and established the Federal Election Commission. But as I mentioned, there are currently 3 commissioners, Trey Traynor, Stephen Walther, and Ellen Weintraub, and 3 vacant seats. You need a majority for the FEC really to do anything. And this has been a very frustrating thing for us as practitioners, because it's not only dealing with the presidential election, but things like advisory opinions, closing down investigations. The FEC is now backlogged, and once it gets up in operation, with respect to this election cycle, we're probably realistically 2 years plus after we get a quorum to actually getting some resolution on any of the issues that arise from it. And that may even be optimistic. The president has nominated somebody for a 4th seat, but his confirmation or consideration of his confirmation is highly unlikely before the election. Looking at sort of how the courts, the Supreme Court has looked at this, the seminal case was Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976. That case upheld limits on contributions to candidates. It upheld the aggregate limit on individuals' total contributions to all candidates and committees in a calendar year, which was subsequently overruled in the McCutcheon case. It upheld mandatory disclosure and reporting provisions. It struck down limits on expenditures by candidates. And it struck down limits on independent expenditures, which is what outside group third parties spend on what we call issue ads or election advocacy ads. The Citizens United case in 2010 held that corporations may spend from their general treasuries. It had nothing to do with the direct contribution prohibition on corporations. that sometimes gets muddled in the media, but what it did allow is third parties, individuals, and corporations via the Citizens United decision can make unlimited independent expenditures. And I think that what that case has truly done, more so than anything, is it has disadvantaged political parties, which, even going back to the Federalist Papers, our founders talked about the mitigating influence, or moderating influence that political parties had on candidates. But now political parties, because of the contribution limits, are really disadvantaged when they're going up against third parties that have unlimited ability to make expenditures. Another case I just want to point out to you, which is not a Supreme Court case, it's a U.S. Court of Appeals case, is Crew v. FEC. What that did, partially because the FEC is not in operation, we're seeing more and more of this. They're not able to truly function in the absence of a quorum. More and more third parties are going to court. And this case basically challenged the FEC for not enforcing its own regulations. And it led to more disclosure for independent expenditures in what is typically the vehicle of the C4 to run ads. And so we will have more disclosure this cycle for non-super PACs, but C4s that make independent expenditures. If you look at this next slide, I just put this up so that people can have an understanding of what those contribution limits are. They're indexed for inflation. If you jump to the last column, you see the $106,500 per account. That is one thing that did change, is that you have the ability to give larger numbers to different party committee accounts. So it can be for legal, their building account, their administrative account, things like that. And as another sort of counter to Citizens United, joint fundraising has become more and more the norm. And so you have something like the Trump Victory Committee or the Biden Victory Committee, which is essentially a fiction. It's not a freestanding committee, an independent freestanding committee, but it's an account in which it lists all these other party committees, and that then, the bottom line number that an individual can give can be very significant. Spending in the 2020 election, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, expected to reach $10.8 billion. The leading super PACs, Priorities USA Action, American Bridge, 21st Century, Unite the Country, the latter of which is actually a client of my firm via my partner, Bill Farah. I point that out just strictly because of the Emory connection. I've got a couple more of those, but combined, those super PACs has spent $132 million. And then on the Republican side, Preserve America, America First has spent over $100 million. I want to talk a little bit about the federal civil and criminal enforcement. I talked about how the FEC is without a quorum and can't enforce the laws, but for knowing and willful violations, the federal government does have a stake here. The criminal division, the civil rights division, the U.S. attorney's offices, and the Office of Public Integrity all weigh in on these issues as they come up. The Office of Public Integrity is actually headed by an Emory Law classmate of mine, Corey Amundson, and it oversees the investigation and prosecution of election crimes. Since at least 1980, the DOJ policy generally bars prosecutors not only from making any announcement about ongoing investigations close to an election, but also from taking public steps such as an arrest or raid before a vote is finalized, because of the publicity could tip the balance of a race. This is essentially what Jim Comey found himself up against, even though he was the FBI and not the Justice Department, but this is the underlying issue of what he did and when and how that could have affected the election. But interesting enough, an email allegedly was sent out last week by the Office of Public Integrity that said an exception to the general non-interference with elections policy will be for anything that affects the voting process through the United States Postal Service, the Department of Defense, or any other federal department or agency. A little bit, just a final word on election security. The FBI Director Chris Wray told Congress that federal authorities had not seen historically any kind of coordinated national voter fraud effort. The Mueller report asserts that in August 2016, hackers successfully did attack a voting technology company that makes voter management software. There certainly have been attempts by agents of the Russian government to do that. And just yesterday, the Justice Department announced charges against Russian intelligence officers and cyber attacks that targeted a French presidential election, the Winter Olympics, and American businesses. These things will occur, but again, hopefully we will be armed to counter that. I just have at the bottom of the slide some food for thought, and in terms of how, if there's going to be any sort of attempts to hack machines, or even in the counties where we saw last cycle social media attempts, fake news by bots and agents of foreign government. If you break it down to the 54 counties and the 6 crucial battleground states, you're not talking about that many jurisdictions. And so if there are challenges, if there are attempts to interfere with their elections, they likely will be there. With that, I'm happy to open it up back to questions.
Great. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, Ken. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is from Mary. She says, why have the FEC open seats not been filled, and how long have they been vacant?
Well, would you want me to take that?
Sure. No, you go ahead, Ken.
They've been, when I came to Washington, by the way, I became head of enforcement at the Federal Election Commission. I spent 8.5 years there. We always had 6 commissioners. I don't think literally there was any time that we did not. We haven't had a full complement of commissioners for many, many months, but at least we had 4, which could make the commission function, or would allow it to function. But there was, I don't know the exact date. I don't know if you know the exact date, Elliot. We had, when this when Trainer came on to the commission in July, we had a 2-week period of which we had 4 commissioners, but Caroline Hunter resigned at the end of July. So back since August, we've been back to 3 commissioners. And during that short period of time, they did do a few things that they were in the that were in the hopper. So basically throughout the pandemic, except for a short period of time, we have been without a quorum. And I can sort of speculate on why that is the case. I don't, you know, I think that there hasn't been a real desire by President Trump to fill the commission and empower it to enforce the law. However, I think once we get past this election, we will fill those seats, and they will be filled with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, even though technically Walter is an independent. He votes with the Democrats. He was appointed by Harry Reid. And that's why it takes 4 votes. So every vote has to be bipartisan on the Federal Election Commission. And the party that's not in power gets to pick their person. So it's not like a Democrat is going to pick some rhino or some Republican is going to pick a Democrat who's very conservative. And that's worked over the years. But this lack of quorum for many, many months, except for that short period of time, is debilitating in terms of the administration of the campaign finance laws at the federal level.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that there's certainly, I get the sense that leadership on both sides are just comfortable with it being the way it is, that they're okay moving into the election because, as Ken said, the minority party or the party that doesn't have the presidency does pick, their nominee too. And so for whatever reason, I think that there's just not a lot of momentum to fill it.
What will change that in a hurry is, and it's something that's not well known about the Federal Election Campaign Act, but a complainant who complains about someone who's violating the law, even though takes time, can sue the commission for failing to act within 120 days of its failure. So months have to pass, will be beyond the election. And then the court rules that the commission needs to act. Well, if it cannot act because it doesn't have 4 commissioners, the complainant gets a private right of action, which is beginning to happen now. And the one thing that Democrats and Republicans do not want are complainants getting private rights of action against respondents. So that's going to be a motivating force to fill those seats. Because once the FEC takes action, then a private litigant cannot bring a case. It's only when the commission fails to act, whether it fails to act because they're deadlocked or it fails to act because they don't have enough commissioners. If a court, after a court rules that they have to act and they don't, that the complainant gets a private lawsuit basically enforcing the Federal Election Campaign Act against an entity that it's brought a complaint against. They have standing.
Great. We have a question from Maxwell. He says, what nightmare scenarios on election night are attorneys working in this area bracing for, and what might those look like, both factually and procedurally?
Well, yeah, they're planning for every contingency, and there's we have a Emory Law alum named Stefan Pasentino, who was deputy White House counsel in the Trump administration and now represents the Trump organization, and he's very involved in all of this. But you better believe that every contingency is being planned for. I remember getting the call. I worked on the Romney campaign, and getting the call that at one point there was contemplation of a 3-state recount. Now that election was not close. I mean, it was not a viable plan. But that's the type of thing that you're going to see. There's every sort of scenario that is laid out, and brace yourselves.
Well, what I think is a nightmare, and I agree with everything you just said, I was CNN's on-air commentator for Bush v. Gore. For 36 days, I was on air, and it was kind of fun for me, but not for the rest of the world. And Bernie Shaw, who was the anchor back then, along with Judy Woodruff, almost every night he would say, Ken, are we in a crisis? And he always wanted me to say it was a crisis because it was sort of good TV. And I said, no, Bernie, you know why? I don't want to characterize it that way. And I met McConnell in the green room right after this, and he was thanking me for it. I said, because it's being adjudicated in the courts. And there's, people protesting here and there in the streets, but it's being adjudicated in the courts, mostly in courts you never heard of, in Fallujah, places in throughout the state of Florida. And I agree with Elliot, if it's a multi-state situation, it'll be that much more complicated, but no more. I don't know what could be closer than 500 votes when at that point, 27 electoral votes or whatever it was, 25 electoral votes were in play, the outcome of the election. So I didn't call it a crisis because it was being adjudicated as much as hand-wringing there was in Bush v. Gore. But if that is not the case this time, if we're having a president who is inciting activity in the streets of America and things are not being adjudicated peacefully in the courts, that's a nightmare scenario.
All right. Nico asks, what has the greatest improvement to election security been since 2016?
Elliot, you want to answer that? Really?
Yeah, there's a number of vendors that are now approved. We've looked at everything from foreign ownership, foreign manufacturers of software, all those sorts of things. We've also moved, largely to paper ballots too. And so, even though the stories, and this is unfortunately where we live in, you hear about like the Pennsylvania situation or ballots being found in dumpsters. It's like it's like seeing a fast car chase, a high-speed chase by police officers. Doesn't mean it's going on in your neighborhood. It doesn't mean it's going on widespread. And so, we had attempts last time, but none of them had any real effect. And so, ultimately, I think on the security side, and especially with the money that we've spent in upgrading our technology, we should be in pretty good shape, and not just to avoid it, but also to detect it and to know where it's coming from. And you've certainly seen the Justice Department, it's hard to actually bring people to trial, but at least they brought indictments for agents of, Russian agents for attempting to do so last cycle.
Yeah, I think we're more on to foreign interference. I don't want to be naive about this because it's moved and it's gotten more sophisticated. But certainly, I think Obama, Hillary couldn't lose. So we're going to bend over backwards. We're not going to aggressively challenge this stuff because we don't want to look like we're putting a thumb on the scale. And this is just one of the many instances, I think, that Trump won because, quote, Hillary couldn't lose. And that's obviously not the situation this time. And I do think that we are more sophisticated in detecting foreign interference. And I think the social media companies, even though there's been a lot of criticism of them, what Facebook has done and even Twitter and some of them just sort of labeling things that are just untrue has helped to some degree, although you've got QAnon out there aggressively growing, which is, very, very disheartening to see. So it's going to be hard to say that we've really got a handle on it, but I think both of those are improvements dealing with foreign interference and social media, not where we should be, but improvements.
All right. Jacob is wondering if either of you have observed an increase in candidates violating rules due to the lack of FEC enforcement.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, just like with the election administration, I've done everything from being a poll worker to counsel the campaigns to run war rooms. Usually it's just ignorance of the law, not real actual malfeasance. It's just people with bad administration. With campaign finance, I've never seen a client or even frankly, somebody on the other side that says, you know what, let's just go ahead and do this because by the time the FEC gets around to it, the election will be well over. I don't see that. I mean, frankly, I don't think candidates walk around knowing that there's a lack of quorum with the FEC and they operate because of that. So I haven't seen that as a big issue.
You have such nice clients, Elliot. That's great. I don't see that. Right now, and you mentioned the Citizens United case, which said that if corporations can't give contributions to candidates, labor unions can't, but they can spend unlimited money in independent expenditures. And what is an independent expenditure? It means one that was not coordinated with the campaign. The whole house of cards falls if there's coordination. It means you can't give $1 if you're a corporation. If you don't coordinate, you can spend $100 million. People are absolutely pressing the envelope when it comes to this concept of coordination. I think, frankly, the FEC was pretty weak even when it has 4 to 6 commissioners. Now, of course, it's completely weak. And by the way, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. So if someone is really flaunting the laws, they could get caught in 3 months from now or 4 months from now. And and it's also a criminal statute, as Elliot has mentioned, and former Emory grad is heading that office. They could prosecute, and may well be a different person if Biden wins. I don't know. Those are career positions. They may not change, but I think people are pushing the envelope, taking some comfort in the lack of enforcement by the Federal Election Commission with or without a quorum. I think generally speaking, most people are complying with the law, but when it comes to independent expenditures, that's a big price tag. 501c4 organizations, super PACs, I think they're relying on the fact that they'll never get caught.
Great. Well, this was very thorough and very informative. But our common thread here today is Emory University, and I'm wondering if each of you could share a story, a fond memory of your time at the school.
Well, I can tell you that this is my life's work. Really, campaign finance is my first love, but all of the regulation of money in politics and the activities, mostly from the perspective of regulating corporations, because I work for a big law firm. But I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for Emory, and if it wasn't for the fact that I happened to be in law school from 1972 to 1975. And there was something going on there in 1975. A guy named Jimmy Carter was running for president. And it turns out that my law firm was renting space to the campaign. And my office, because I was like the most junior person in the law firm, they stuck me down with the campaign people with the crappy offices down there. Little did I know my office would be next to the chief of staff for the next president of the United States, or the Hamilton Jordan and people like that, and really got to know them just by running into them, 6 times a day, going to wherever I was going. And then all of a sudden, Ted Koppel is waiting in the waiting room outside my office, and my the chief lawyer in my firm, the head lawyer in the firm, who I became close to, became chief White House counsel, was actually treasurer of the campaign. As a consequence, I spent election night with Jimmy Carter and his family, which is a memory you can't ever change. And it's just something that was an amazing experience. And in his suite was his kids. I think Amy Carter sat on my lap for a good part of the evening. Martin Luther King Sr. was in there with the Carter family. And because they moved everybody out right before they announced the winner, which was not until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, because he wanted the results of Mississippi and Ohio declared by all 3 networks, and CBS was holding out. CNN didn't matter back then. I was the first person he saw outside of his immediate family and Martin Luther King. He didn't really know who I was. He kind of knew me, but didn't really. And I said, "We won." And I said, "You won." And he looked at me, he said, "And we won," and went downstairs and declared victory. So that was very, very exciting. And my job in Washington, it was a result of the chief White House counsel who came to Washington and stayed there for 8 years. So there's so much serendipity in life, you just don't know. Watergate was happening when I was in law school, and that's why I do what I do.
That's great. Well, I'll share a story that also involves Jimmy Carter. It's nowhere near as significant as Ken's, but I interned at the Carter Center for Credit at Emory Law School my second year. They took me as a Republican. In fact, it was no issue, which was a great life lesson. I worked in the conflict resolution program, and I had a friend that was working in the Latin American studies, and his boss at the time was a guy named Bob Pastor. Bob had been nominated to be ambassador to Panama by President Clinton, and he thought that was going to happen, but ultimately Jesse Helms had a problem with Bob because when he worked for President Carter, he blamed Bob Pastor for the Panama Canal. And so he blocked it. And so Bob had already sold his house, and he asked my friend to help him move. And my friend asked me, and he says, "Look, he'll give us some pizza and give us a little money." And I said, "Great, as a law school student, you're always looking for money." So I helped him move. Well, flash forward, 8 years later, Bob was the executive director of the Carter-Baker Commission, which was a commission that was impaneled to look at election reform. And they came into the Congress to present it. I was general counsel to the House Majority Leader. And so I was the point person on it. And so Bob comes in the office. He didn't remember me. But I said, "I haven't seen you since I helped you move." And he just looked at me like, "What's going on here?" And so I explained it. And so it was a nice sort of full circle moment. He was a good guy. He sadly passed away a few years ago.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you for sharing those. Ken, you did some work on West Wing as an advisor on election law issues. Can you talk a little bit about that experience, and have they contacted you about a reunion?
Another one of these crazy, they're going to have a reunion. Lawrence, I represented Senator Moynihan when I was in Washington after I left the government, along with even in connection with I've been at Skadden since 1986, so all these years. Lawrence O'Donnell was chief of staff to Senator Moynihan back then. And now he has a TV show on MSNBC, but what he did before that is he went to Hollywood and he wrote he was the screenwriter for The West Wing, and Aaron Sorkin was the executive producer. And I was, Lawrence would call me up from time to time and ask me FEC questions, but I came out there one time to the lot at Paramount, and I'm, with Lowe and Rob Lowe and all these famous people. I didn't actually see Martin Sheen, but I saw the other members in the cast. And then we go out to lunch in the commissary. All the General Hospital people were over there and the West Wing people. And he said, you know, we're doing an episode on the Federal Election Commission. And just explain to me how it works. I said, well, you know, there's 6 commissioners, 3 required, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and all this other stuff. And he was nodding. And then I'm watching the show a couple of weeks later, and because he had asked me specifically, you know, is that by law? And I said, yes, it's by law. And I'm watching the show a couple of weeks later, and it says President Bartlett announced that he's appointing 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans to the Federal Election Commission because he thinks it's fair. He thinks it's just like a nice, fair, bipartisan thing to do. And I'm like, you know, I just told him that 2 weeks earlier that was not the reason. That's, you know, the law provides for it. It's not because it's fair. So then after they go to commercial, CJ, the press secretary, comes running in saying, I don't believe you guys just had the president say that. There's a legal requirement that he appoint 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. You screwed this up. Now you're going to have to go into the Oval Office and explain to the president why you're such a bunch of dumbasses. And they made a big production about it. So I called up Lawrence afterwards, after the show, and I said, Lawrence, I said, what was that all about? He says, well, when you told me that, we had already shot the first part of the episode where they said he did it to be fair. And when you told me that, we had to figure out what to do, either reshoot it or work the mistake into the script. So we decided to work the mistake into the script. So that really is my piece of history. The mistake in the second half of one of the West Wing shows, and I just thought it was kind of a funny thing. But it was a lot. It was great being involved with Hollywood. My brush with Hollywood.
That's great. Elliot, you've acted as counsel for a couple of charity events where ZZ Top and Leonard Skinner and the Who have played. I guess my first question is, how do you have time to do that? And then the second one is, do you have a good story about this?
Well, I've found that it's a great way to stay sane doing these charity events. I mean, when I worked in government, you know, you get the satisfaction of working on policy issues. But I have to say, since I've been out of government and representing a lot of charities and causes that I care about, I found it just as, if not more, fulfilling. But I started working during the conventions. Conventions always have, you know, parties. And I was hired initially doing what it is Ken and I do every day, which is making them compliant so that elected officials and candidates can attend. And from there, I got to know a lot of artists. I did an event with Kid Rock, Journey, Trace Adkins, Leonard Skinner, as you mentioned, and just got to know artists and management. And from there, just really developed friendships and got into the entertainment law space too. And so I'll just tell you a little bit, as you mentioned, ZZ Top. So one of the events I did a few years ago now, Speaker Boehner decided he wanted a bust of Winston Churchill in the Capitol. And, you know, the initial motivation was partly due to President Obama and the fake scandal of the Churchill bust and all of that, which was really nonsense. But by the time the event happened, nobody wanted to talk about that. I mean, it was, we want the president there, Secretary of State. I mean, it was completely bipartisan. And so we held the event, and we ultimately got Roger Daltrey of the Who to perform, which was great. We ended up naming the area of the Capitol Freedom Foyer, which it is now known as, and there's 2 more spaces open. And so we decided to do a bust of Václav Havel. And so I thought that, you know, this is going to be easy. I mean, we got Roger Daltrey to perform from the Who strictly by virtue of the fact that they were both British. And Havel was friends with James Taylor, you know, famously friends with Frank Zappa, you know, Bono. You go down the list, which we did, and we got no conflict. Would love to do it. We thought we had Bono. He couldn't do it, and then he ultimately that's when he got into that biking accident, and so he would have canceled. So we were about 10 days out, and the speaker's office said, we really want A-list entertainment. So I did a Hail Mary to everyone I knew in the industry. And a friend of mine said, you know, this is a little weird, but I think it could work, and I think he would do it. And that's Billy Gibbons' ZZ Top. And it turns out, you know, it was like, okay. And we talked to Billy, and he said he considered it an honor. And we thought, well, how do we sell this? This is really, really difficult. And so we started moving through sort of the narrative, and we found out that where Billy's from in Houston, surprisingly, it's the second or third biggest Czech community in America. ZZ Top was one of the first bands to play in Prague after the Iron Curtain fell, not like the Rolling Stones did. And we almost had Keith Richards for this at one point, but you know, within a year or so, ZZ Top played. So one of the first bands, and President Havel had likely attended that concert. And so, you know, we went into it. Well, the Czechs absolutely loved Billy because he was so theatrical and, you know, and everything. So they couldn't have been more thrilled by it. And by the end of it, you know, it worked really well. But it was a bit of a, you know, square peg round hole going into it. But he and I have stayed great friends. So, you know, that's what you find with these things, is it's really the friendships that matter in the end.
I don't have a roster like that, but I did represent a guy named Sean Combs, who is P. Diddy. And when P. Diddy did Rock the Vote at the conventions, and we set up a 501c3, and it was pretty interesting going into his, getting into the world of P. Diddy. He was actually a very good client. He listened to everything I said. He was a very serious guy when it came to the law. Yeah. So frankly, I knew who he was, but I didn't really know the music. But while he wasn't on the phone, but I was on the phone with his people. And I was multitasking, you know, clicking my computer to see what music's, you know, what his big songs were. And it was like Bad Boy rap records. All of a sudden, lasting out of my computer was some of his music that was, let's just say, not the greatest thing to be blasting over a conference call. I couldn't mute it. Every time I hit the computer key, it seemed to get louder. I mean, I literally got down on my hands and knees and unplugged the computer. But it was one of my many fun experiences in doing election law.
We do have fun once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks, guys. This has been excellent. It's been so informative and a lot of fun. So thank you both for taking the time to talk with us today. We all really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Steve, I think you're going to close us out.
You're on mute, Steve.
You're on mute. We can't hear you, Steve.
There we go. Apologies. I just want to thank you both again for helping out and lending your expertise tonight. Just a couple quick reminders from the Alumni Association of the university. We've got plenty more virtual opportunities via Zoom or webinar at emorycollective.com. That's where a recording of this session will be. Additionally, homecoming is this weekend. We have over 30 different free virtual sessions to take part in, including the law school and Rollins doing a joint session on talking about the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Supreme Court. And we also have cast members of the Hamilton joining our musical showcase, and a virtual town hall from your couch to his couch with President Fenves. So I hope that you'll take advantage of free registration for homecoming this weekend. If you're interested in local opportunities with our networks here in DC, you can email regionalnetworks@emory.edu. We're always looking for great volunteers to help us drive local events for our DC community, which is just near 6,000 alumni strong. And then last but not least, would encourage you to think about how you can provide your time and talent to Emory, whether it's as a volunteer and doing your part here in the region or with the Alumni Association, or by making a gift to an area of your specific designation at the university to help us advance Emory's mission to create, preserve, teach, and apply knowledge in the service of humanity. We want to thank you all for taking part in this evening's session, for being here with us, and we hope to see you at an upcoming future event, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.